Yeah.
Yep, we're
How did
recording.
that happen? Did you
I did it
figure
on my
something?
phone. I did it on my phone.
Oh, okay. All right.
We're good.
We'll stop this screen flow stuff. All right, cool. All right, so we scrambled around a little bit after we realized we wanted to record this, and so we are just recording the session now, the beginning of the first session. We have been chatting for a little while, but I'll do just a really quick recap, and then we're just going to continue on from where we were. But the discussion we had is I'm hoping over these three talks to talk about all the potential that assessment has in multiple different ways. And I thought I'd start by a very traditional and often sort of shunned approach, which is multiple choice exams, and talk about how they can be constructed and used in a way that can be very useful, especially maybe even under times like these COVID times that we're in now. And so I was starting by, and this is a document that I can share generally, and this is a document I give to my teaching assistants who we ask to create multiple choice questions every term. So let me also give you this context again because it's just relevant. It's the world I live in. So I teach an extremely large 1,800 student introduction to psychology class at University of Toronto Scarborough. And my challenge is always to still try to make this a really deep, rich learning experience, even though it's 1,800 students strong. In fact, sometimes we're going to harness the students. But my first challenge often is, well, every now and then I need to assess what they've learned as they've gone, as much to keep them reading and to keep them sort of paying attention and making sure they're keeping up with me. We have regular, like every 3 weeks or so, we have lower stakes multiple choice exams. And the 1,800 students is why at some level we're using multiple choice exams. However, what I also hope to give you a clear sense of is if you use them in a very intelligent, sort of thought out way, they can have a role in a course like mine. I would never see them as the whole thing. Like my enemy is lectures and multiple choice exams, and that's it. There needs to be a lot more rich stuff. So we're going to talk about authentic assessment over the next little while. We're going to talk about sort of work integrated learning approaches and how you can do those in any classroom. But I wanted to start with this sort of primitive, almost assessment approach that we have of multiple choice questions. And so, with that in mind, there's really a couple things and maybe a third that I want to hit today. The first thing is going to be about question creation, how you create the question. The second one is too, but it's going to be with relation to something called Bloom's hierarchy. And we'll talk a little bit about things like open book exams, open book multiple choice exams, say during a pandemic, and how you can still use them in a way in which your best students get the best grades. And that's the real goal. And so, and maybe let me just say that again, just to really stress it. For me, when I'm assessing students and I'm worrying about things like academic integrity, cheating, or whatever, the central point that I'm always trying to achieve is that I know that some students have read the work carefully, have thought about it carefully, and know it better. And I want to make sure that those students end up with a better score than the students that don't, so that our assessment actually separates students out based on knowledge, which sounds like an obvious thing, but this is where cheating, this is why cheating is a problem, right? Cheating is a problem because it masks the actual knowledge of the students, and it's the good students that you now can't tell that they're good because the cheaters are just as good as they are. So, all that to say, we want to think about creating a fair testing experience that really gets at what students know. And to start with, we were really focusing on multiple choice items and how you construct them, and really trying to. So this is the work of David DiBattista, as highlighted here, from Brock University, and he is a real multiple choice nut. that's what he thinks about all the time. And again, his big issue is one of, okay, when you're creating these questions, you want to keep in mind that some of your students are not as proficient at the English language as other students are. And the grade they get on a test should not be a grade that reflects their English proficiency. It should be a grade that reflects their knowledge of the course. And so we have to be careful how we write these questions to make sure that we're not disadvantaging, let's say, English as a second language students more than those who are native English speakers. And so David Batista has a whole list of things, and we've been talking about some of them. So I'll get to the highlighted one, but we'll go really quickly here and just say that there's certain kinds of questions that are harder if you're in a second language, and that includes these so-called sentence completion. When you begin a sentence and then the student has to figure out how it ends, that's harder in a second language than it is in your natural language. And so his first tip is try to just ask straightforward questions when you can, rather than these ones that require the student to complete it. Write those sentences clearly as you can, include as much relevant information as possible, but reduce the amount of irrelevant information, because irrelevant information really messes with people who have poor language skills. It throws them off more. And that's not really what you want to be doing. Obviously, look for spelling errors and anything else that might distract or confuse somebody who's not really proficient in English. And now let's get to where we kind of were here, which is just to say, when you're negating something, first of all, try not to do that. I realize I just used a negating thing when I said that. But if you can, ask sentences in a straightforward, positive way, right? So try to reduce the number of commas, make it as non-complex as possible. Try to ask it in a straightforward way. If you do need to use a negation, if you want to say something like, which of the following parts of the nervous system are not located in the brain? If you really want to use that not, then capitalize it. Have a capital NOT so that people can really see, oh, not in the brain, and it cues it for them. All distractors should be plausible. These crazy distractors we pull out sometimes. I used to be guilty of adding a funny distractor because I wanted to make the test experience a little more fun for students. I don't know if that's such a bad thing, but David Batista says it is. He says and by the way, this is all based on research he's done in his lab, let me say. He's not just saying these things. So that when you have something that's really kind of out there, again, the non-ESL students are thrown by that more than an ESL student. So better to have a list of plausible ones. And here's his favorite thing that some people find odd, but he says usually you want one right answer and 3 distractors. So 4 alternatives. Once you get to the 5th alternative, you're usually out of plausible ones. And so you're not really picking anything that's really likely to fool anybody at that point anyway. And what you're doing is just adding more distraction to the question. Once again, hitting the ESL students a little bit more. Some idea of how to generate those alternatives, those distractors. So we'll talk about the correct answer, and then the distractors here are sometimes called the foils. So if you have previous tests and you can find common errors, sometimes those are good to have as distractors to kind of see if the student is able to, make that difference between the right one and something that a lot of students think are true. Try to make the distractors as similar as possible in content, length, and complexity. Use words that sound important or have associations to the stem, and use distractors that are true but do not correctly answer the question. So yeah, those are just his thoughts there. Balancing the answer key so that the correct answer is in all positions. This is kind of funny. We've all been told that, when in doubt, pick C kind of thing. David Batista did a lot of analyses of real multiple choice questions that people just created by hand. And sure enough, people don't like to pick the first or the last as a place for the right answer. They avoid if you don't just randomize it, they avoid the A and the if there's 4 distractors, D option. And so C, it is often B or C. If a human is allowed to just create the test, the better thing to do is to randomize, literally use something that randomly assigns where the correct answer goes, and it should be just as likely to be an A, a B, a C, or a D. And if you do that, you get rid of that natural human bias, and yeah, it's just a better test that way. Do not use none of the above or all of the above when generally possible. And he says unless there are only 2 distractors, okay, but generally avoid using none of the above and all of the above. Almost always when we use them, they're right. That's the right answer. And so it's just kind of a weird thing to use there. So ignore any preceding suggestions unless you have a good reason to do so. Ignore any of the preceding suggestions when you have a good reason to do so. So he's saying feel free to overrule these things if you have a good reason, but if you don't have a good reason, these are some things to keep in mind. Okay, so let me just kind of stop there for a second and just ask any thoughts or questions about that we want to chat about.
No, I've just been thinking of another layer in terms of now that many of our classes in the grade 9 level are D stream, so mixed abilities, also literacy being an issue.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
this could also work if we take a look at it through a literacy lens too, in terms of making sure language level is appropriate so that everyone can access the text and therefore show us what they know.
Absolutely. Yeah, that's the real key. Show us what you know. We don't want to confuse you by doing stuff like that. Yeah, fantastic. Okay, cool. So now let's get to the fun other layer to put on this. Have you run into Bloom's taxonomy, Mafusa?
In Teachers College, yes.
Teachers College has been a while. Excellent. I'll bring it back to you, but I'll bring it back to you from a pandemic lens. Okay, so somebody needed a picture of me then. I'm not that so focused. All right, let me see. What's the best example to give you a sense of it? This is a very common one that people use. Hopefully it can make it bigger. There we go. Okay, so the idea behind Bloom's taxonomy is that there's different levels at which students can know something. And you can, through careful construction of, say, a multiple choice test, you can get at how deeply they actually know something. And this is really important. Like, for example, in the pandemic, I'm going to talk about 2 things, and we'll just talk them through because I don't know. I can tell you what we do at the university, and it'll be interesting to see whether some of these same techniques would even be used in more of a secondary setting or not. But here's the basic idea, first of all. Students, what do we think of the standard student? They come across some piece of information. I don't know, intro psych. They hear the variable that an experimenter manipulates in an experiment is called the independent variable. What do we imagine the typical student doing when they're studying? The variable that the experimenter manipulates in an experiment is called the independent variable. The variable that the experimenter manipulates. So they repeat it over and over to themselves, and they do this rote learning thing to try to stamp that definition into their mind. That's cool, and that's as far as some students go. They just know all the material at that level, but they don't necessarily understand the material, nor can they necessarily apply it. So the idea of Bloom's hierarchy is this is kind of a pyramid where the upper levels depend on you sort of reaching things at the lower levels. These highest 3 levels are going to be hard to tap with a multiple choice test, but the lower ones you can. And you can use those to create a valid assessment, or at least as valid as you can, even in an open book pandemic kind of environment. And let me just sort of give you a sense of how, rather than keeping it mystified. So that example I just suggested, the variable that an experimenter manipulates in an experiment is called the independent variable. If I'm writing a multiple choice question to assess that learning, I can write one that is called verbatim. It's essentially a verbatim question where I might twist it a little bit, but I might say something like the independent variable is the variable that, so there's one of those stem completion ones I shouldn't use. But anyway, is the variable that, and one of the options could be the experimenter manipulates during an experiment. And so really we're connecting with the information that pretty much the same way the student learned it. And if they have that memorized, they can make that association. But here's a different way to see if they know that information. We could say, here's a study that somebody did. And we could tell them a lot about that study. Remember, I'm going to kind of conflict now with do not include irrelevant information in the STEM unless it plays a role in the assessment procedure. So I'm going to suggest one where it does. So imagine I describe an experiment, and I describe a lot about the experiment. So-and-so was testing some theory about X. The theory said this would happen. They ran an experiment. They gave students different levels of caffeine, and then maybe assessed how well they did on an exam in the class. And so we tell them all, and the results showed X, Y, or Z. So the students see all this description of an experiment. Now we can ask them questions like, what was the independent variable in that experiment? And so for now they're kind of applying, which relies on understanding. So if they really understood that definition, it's the thing the experimenter manipulated. What did the experimenter manipulate in this brand new context that I've never seen before? Oh, they're manipulating the amount of caffeine a student gets and seeing what effect that has. And so the variable they manipulated was the amount of caffeine. So if a student understands, they can apply their understanding and knowledge and answer questions that involve new situations that they've never seen before. That situation, that experiment was never in their textbook. It's brand new, and yet they can use their learning to kind of answer that kind of question. This is important when it's sometimes combined with a timing thing. So how do we do things? So first of all, let me say, I'll just walk you through this thing that I give to my TAs and that I'll share with everybody. It includes discussion about Bloom's taxonomy and how you can use it to get at knowledge in different dimensions. And it ultimately gives some examples of questions that get at these different levels of knowledge. TAs are instructed to create questions at different levels. So I have some of these essentially verbatim questions, some of these questions where we do in fact ask about the information almost exactly as students received it. But we have others that get at those other levels of the hierarchy, and they require a deeper level of understanding in order for students to do well with the questions. They're also not something they're going to find in the textbook. And so what we typically do in university, and I'm really curious about your reaction, is we give students only a certain amount of time to answer each question. This has been this has been a nasty part of the pandemic. We've had to make testing more stressful during a stressful time, which is not cool. But previous pandemic, we used to bring people into a testing center, have them all sitting in front of us. They would have their exam booklet. They could go through questions. They could go back to previous questions that they missed. And they just had, like, say, 2 hours to do the whole exam. When we're doing it in the pandemic, most of us now are presenting one question at a time. The students get so much time to answer that question, typically about a minute to a minute and a half per question, sometimes up to 2, depending on how they decide it. And they don't get to go back to the question. This is more stressful for students, right? They like to be able to go back and think about things. And by the way, the evidence suggests that often when they change things, they change it for the worse. So it's not necessarily a good thing for them to be going back, but it does make the testing environment feel a little more comfortable. It makes them feel a little more empowered. And as soon as we start saying, no, there's a question, it's up, you got a timer, it's gone, they feel a little more under pressure, obviously. So why would we do that to them? Well, because of almost a combination of everything I've been talking about, we want the students who really understand the material to do better. At some level, I, as an instructor, don't care what the average on the exam is. I don't want it to be too low because I don't want students feeling totally disheartened during my exam. But my real objective is to separate students based on how well they know the material. And when we mix timing with Bloom's hierarchy, we can do that because the idea is if you really understood, say that independent variable question, you knew what an independent variable was, you got it, then reading that description and saying, oh, it's caffeine, is easy for you. But if you don't, if you've only memorized everything, you can go to an index in a textbook, you can find the part on independent variable, you can run to that definition of independent variable. It's still not going to have that description of an experiment sitting there. So you're going to have to really think about it and either achieve understanding in a very short period of time, or you're not going to get the question right. And so by having these questions at different levels, we can literally see what level a student is capable of performing well at. And we see that certain students are able to do these more challenging questions compared to those that cannot. And these students end up getting better grades because they know the material. So you can't substitute understanding by going through a textbook really quickly. So I have to ask now, in the secondary situation, are you shocked and horrified at how we're doing this testing, or what are your thoughts on what you just heard?
So I'm processing it as a secondary teacher where I've had students who have IEPs. So just the idea of time constraints.
Yeah.
I'm trying to justify it in my head, like, because we do give extended time for students who are on IEP, so
Yep.
individual education plans.
Mhm.
But it's interesting, I guess, the way we could modify that in the secondary kind of realm would be, instead of time being marks allotted to a question versus like a understand versus an apply question.
Yeah.
Because the students who need, because I know, like, I'm pretty sure I myself could have used more time processing. Like, I take a while to think things through. So I know my students who are on IEPs who need that extra processing time. But like you said, they're not going to all of a sudden have this brainstorm and understand. And like, if they just have that surface level, they can do what we call the Googleable question,
Yeah.
where Google can answer it. But will they have that deep understanding to be able to do the next type of question? So,
So
yeah.
we also have so we have accessibility services, and students register for accessibility services, and they can get accommodations. And one of the accommodations that they do get quite frequently is extra time. So that means if you you say, okay, you get a minute and a half to do this question. Well, depending on a student's accommodation, they might get 3 minutes to do that question if they had double the time or whatnot. So those multipliers are applied, but it is still the case that they're still doing it under time stress, maybe a sense of the time stress, but yeah.
That's true.
Uh,
That's true. I didn't think of it that way, but
yeah.
yeah.
Cool. All right. So I want to do one, I want to take this one other step. Katina, you're going to have to remind me, are we going to 8 or 8:30 tonight, or how long are we going here?
Top of the hour.
8 o'clock. Yeah, top of the hour.
Top of the hour, 8 o'clock. So we're almost there. So let me just give you a taste of something. Man, I forget the formal. There's an acronym. But I will TAPT scratch multiple choice. Well, okay. I don't know if this is
Welcome to another Learn.
Freaking jumpins. There's some acronym like that. TATP. Nope. No, okay. I get the wrong acronym. But I'm going to tell you, maybe we can rebuild the acronym. There's a fascinating newer approach to multiple choice exams that we're doing in a sort of digital way. But I was going to introduce you to the non-digital way of doing it. So I'll just tell you about it. The non-digital way involves little scratch cards, literally scratch cards. And what the student gets is a multiple choice question, and they're allowed to start scratching. But the idea is, if they can scratch the right answer first with the first thing they scratch, then they get full points for that question. But if they don't get that question right, they can scratch another answer, and they get slightly less points if they get it right. Or even if you can even go to a third one, if you had 4 alternatives, and they get slightly less. But they're allowed to continue with a question until they get it right. There's a lot of evidence, and I'll be talking more about this in the second one, where we'll talk a lot more about this thing called the testing effect and how you can use it to promote learning. But there's a lot of evidence that students are learning while they're being tested. And the potential danger there that we've shown in our lab is on a multiple choice test, if a student chooses the wrong answer, but then they're allowed to go on, and there's no immediate signal telling them it was the wrong answer, they often learn that. They form that association between the question and the answer they chose, which means they can be actually learning misinformation as they go. So more and more, we're thinking, if you use multiple choice questions, it's important not to let the student wander on without knowing what the right answer was. You want to kind of, while they're in the question, correct and put them toward the right answer. So these scratch and win sorts of cards are meant to do that, where the student can pick the wrong answer, but then they keep going until they find the right one. And it's all about how many attempts does it take them. So the really cool thing with this is they do always end up getting the right answer. They get some points on every question. And now, which feels kind of nice. They always get something out of every question. It's just, maybe do I get 3, 2, or 1 point on this question? And in the old school version, you did literally have everybody with a penny and a little scratch card, and they would scratch these answers out and give you back the card, but they could see the score right away there as well. They knew what score they got. So that's a cool idea that starts to introduce the idea that even a multiple choice exam, a multiple choice test, is never purely an assessment of learning. Students are very engaged when they're writing exams. Their mind is there 100%. They're thinking really hard about what they're experiencing, and they're learning. They're forming these associations. And if we're not careful, they could be forming bad associations. So the TATP, or whatever it is, I'll start with a nice presentation with a proper acronym next time. But that is one approach to do that, a very concrete one. And now there's a lot of digital approaches for doing the same thing. So have you seen any of those reach the school system?
I have. I think I've heard of it once, but I hadn't seen it in practice. I was going to ask, have you been able to use it? Do you use this method with your 1800 students?
We do, in fact, but you notice that this thing I've been showing you is called MTuner, writing MCQs. So we have another tech, so of Peer Scholar. Peer Scholar is the kind of one we have out there, but we've actually created some other technologies that we don't have out there, simply because I've learned how hard it is to have one tech out there. So supporting Peer Scholar itself has been a major challenge. And so MTuner, which is meant to be Mind Tuner, is a tech that I'll probably show you next class that does all this in a digital way. So rather than scratching, students are seeing it in a multiple choice format. The really nice thing about MTuner is it works in the following way. They pick something, and now, rather than just letting them pick another one, like let's say they picked wrong, rather than just letting them pick another one, we push them to a page of a textbook. Or in our case, because all the lectures are recorded, we sometimes push them to a specific part of a lecture. And we say, hey, go over there, because the answer that you're looking for is somewhere there. Now it still could be that Bloom's hierarchy thing, right? It might not be the exact answer that they're looking for, but at least some information that should help them answer the question is there. And so we push them there and say, take a look, try to figure it out, and then come back and try again. Take a second guess. And so then they get a second attempt. We don't usually go to the third attempt. Usually we don't have to. So we give 3 points if they get it right the first time, 1 point if they get it right after going and visiting something. And irregardless of whether they get it right then or not, we always end the question by highlighting what the right answer is and a little explanation of why that's the right answer. Because we're really kind of making sure they are not going to go past this question until they know what the right answer was and why it was right. And so we're really using now a little bit of that scratch idea, but kind of pumping it up and making it the deepest possible learning experience we can. And the way I think of that is what the test is then doing is, to the extent the students know something already, they're getting good credit for that. To the extent they don't, it's almost like we're doing the relearning right there as part of the test. We're not going to let them get through the test until hopefully we've corrected any misconceptions they might have and have them gain on the sort of right path. So if that's tempting or interesting, then I'll say this is a Zygarnik effect thing. You know how you watch TV and they say, who's the masked singer? Well, we'll find out after the commercial. Maybe next week when we do this, I'll show the mTuner thing and we'll talk about something called the testing effect in general. I'll show you how mTuner works, and then we'll talk about some other ways you can use it all through your classroom to do assessment for learning. And then in the third one, then we're going to get to the assessment as learning, where we're really using the assessment context as a place to promote really deep and sometimes very different kinds of learning going on. That was my plan. The first day was a little interesting. I thank you so much, Mafusa, for your attention, for your questions, for your participation, and for your understanding that. I talk about airhead prof syndrome. I don't think I ran into it as much as I did an hour ago. My goodness.
You've piqued my interest because I don't think, in terms of my district and even like being in the classroom, just even the last year or the year before last, we don't have a tool like that. Like, yes, we could probably do some portion of that using a Google form where we can give them feedback, but the idea of giving them credit for like partial credits, like, okay, you're on the right track. So, or it took you 3 attempts, but you got the right answer. How do we don't have that ability currently in the secondary level. How's that?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Dean, this is where I need your company. I don't have the bandwidth to be an entrepreneur for 2 products right now, but mTuner is definitely in demand and out there. It's that's really interesting to hear. I hope you come back again next time. I'd love to get your thoughts if you actually saw it in action. Whew. Now you've got me tempted to try to think about how to get that out there again.
Well, I'm very curious. So yes, I will do my best to be here next week.
Fantastic. Thank